Why did a luxury yacht club kick out Shaq, only to beg him to stay hours later? How did a cocky manager go from running the club to scrubbing its floors? And what shocking move did Shaq make that changed everything in a single moment? This wasn't just about getting denied entry. This was about power, respect, and the ultimate payback. By the end of the night, Shaq didn't just walk into the club, he owned it. And the man who tried to kick him out? Let's just say his new job came with a mop. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The sun glistened off the deep blue water as Shaq stepped out of his sleek black SUV, adjusting his sunglasses. The ocean breeze was warm, carrying the scent of salt and freshly grilled seafood from the nearby patio. He had been to plenty of high-end spots before, but the moment he set foot near the entrance of the Seaside Yacht Club, he felt it. The stares. Men in tailored linen suits and women in designer dresses held their champagne flutes just a little too still, their conversations briefly pausing. Some turned away, whispering behind manicured hands, while others made no effort to hide their curiosity. A silver-haired man near the valet nudged his wife, muttering something that made her shake her head disapprovingly. Shaq smirked. He had seen this before. This wasn't admiration, wasn't even curiosity. It was the kind of scrutiny that measured a person, a silent test of whether or not they belonged. But Shaq didn't care about their little games. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here for a meal. The club entrance was framed by towering white pillars, giving it the air of an elite country club. A massive gold-plated sign read, "Private members only, exclusivity defined." Shaq walked toward the entrance with his usual stride, confident, unbothered, effortless. But before he could even reach the door, the staff inside stiffened. A young waiter standing near the host stand shifted awkwardly, eyes darting to a man in a navy blue suit at the front desk. William Hartley. The name tag pinned neatly on his chest confirmed it. His posture was stiff, controlled, but the tightness in his expression gave him away. He had been waiting for this moment, probably hoping it wouldn't happen. Hartley took a single step forward, cutting Shaq off before he could even cross the threshold. "Sir, you must be lost," he said smoothly, his lips curling into a forced smile. Shaq slowly slid off his sunglasses, eyes narrowing slightly. "Here we go." "Lost?" Shaq repeated, his deep voice carrying easily over the hushed murmurs behind him. "Nah, man. Pretty sure I parked in the right spot." Hartley tilted his head slightly, his hands clasped in front of him like a well-trained gatekeeper. "This is a private establishment," he explained as if Shaq didn't already know. His tone remained polite, but the implication was clear. "You don't belong here." Shaq glanced past him, toward the lavish patio, where guests sipped imported champagne and dined on plates that probably cost more than most people's rent. "Yeah," he said casually. "Looks like a restaurant to me." Hartley let out a rehearsed chuckle, shaking his head. "We have a very strict guest policy," he continued, his voice dipping slightly. "I assume you're not a member?" Shaq's smirk didn't fade. He could pull out his phone and make one call. Could have flashed his wealth or name-dropped any number of people who would happily vouch for him. But instead, he wanted to see just how far they were willing to go. "I was thinking of grabbing a meal," Shaq said, his voice casual but firm. "Maybe looking around." A group of older men at the bar, dressed in crisp white polos, exchanged knowing looks. One of them, a tan man with graying hair, sipped his drink and muttered under his breath, "This should be interesting." Hartley, clearly feeling the eyes of the club on him, tightened his grip on the leather-bound guest list in his hands. Then, with a practiced, dismissive smile, he turned to a nearby waiter and snapped his fingers. "Kindly escort this gentleman out." The moment Shaq had been waiting for. The air felt heavier, the tension thickening as all eyes remained on Shaq. Hartley, the club manager, kept his arms crossed, his polished nails tapping lightly against his cuff. His pristine navy suit was neatly pressed, his shoes shining like he never stepped on anything but marble floors and expensive rugs. "We have a strict guest policy," he said smoothly, his tone carrying just enough arrogance to be irritating. Shaq didn't move, didn't even blink. He just let the words hang there for a second, watching as the club members pretended to sip their drinks, trying and failing to make their curiosity less obvious. Yeah, Shaq finally said, keeping his voice calm and steady. What's the policy say about letting a guy grab a meal? Hartley smirked, shifting his weight to one side. Sir, this isn't a public beach, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. A soft chuckle floated from the bar. Shaq's eyes flicked to a group of older men lounging near the counter, their cocktails half finished, their leather loafers crossed lazily as they watched the situation unfold like a live show. One of them, a man with silver-streaked hair and a deep tan, leaned toward his friend and muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. Another stifled a laugh, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Shaq tilted his head, expression unreadable. You laughing at something? He asked, his voice casual, but sharp enough to cut. The older man simply grinned, raising his glass slightly. Just enjoying the entertainment, he replied, not even trying to mask the smug amusement in his voice. Hartley, sensing the attention on him, straightened his tie and forced a polite smile. Sir, he said, his voice now eerily patient, like he was talking to someone who just couldn't take a hint. This club maintains a certain standard. Our guests expect a certain level of exclusivity. Shaq exhaled slowly, pressing his lips together like he was trying not to laugh. He'd heard that tone before, that thinly veiled excuse. They weren't going to outright say why they didn't want him there, but they didn't have to. The message was clear. Hartley turned to a young waiter, a man who couldn't have been older than 25. His grip on the silver tray in his hands visibly tightened, his eyes darting between Shaq and his boss. Kindly escort this gentleman out. The waiter froze, hesitation flashing across his face. Shaq saw it, the discomfort, the unease. This kid knew what was happening wasn't right, but he also knew his job depended on playing along. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Hartley's face as he realized something. Shaq wasn't moving. Instead of stepping back, Shaq casually slipped his phone from his pocket and started typing. A slow, knowing smirk crept across his face. Shaq's fingers paused over his phone screen, his smirk widening as he finished typing. Hartley, the manager, tilted his head, trying to read what Shaq was up to. The tension in the room was thick now. The waiter, still standing awkwardly by his side, looked trapped, his grip tightening on the tray as if it were his only lifeline. Shaq finally slipped his phone back into his pocket and raised an eyebrow at Hartley. All right, he said, folding his arms. Let's see how deep this goes. A few guests near the bar turned their attention fully to the exchange, sensing something about to unfold. Hartley scoffed, shaking his head. Sir, I've already explained. Shaq cut him off. If I pay up front, will you serve me? Hartley blinked, momentarily thrown off. He hadn't expected Shaq to push back this calmly. This isn't about money, he said, forcing a tight-lipped smile. This club maintains a certain standard. There it was again, that thinly veiled excuse, dripping with the kind of elitism Shaq had seen 100 times before. From across the room, a woman in a designer dress, her jewelry sparkling under the dim chandeliers, chuckled into her champagne glass. She leaned toward her friend and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. He actually thought he could just walk in. More murmurs, more smug looks. Shaq didn't react immediately. Instead, he slowly looked around the room, letting his gaze settle on each person who had laughed, whispered, or smirked. Then he let out a low chuckle. Y'all really don't even try to hide it, huh? He muttered, shaking his head. Hartley exhaled, clearly annoyed now. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Shaq didn't move. Instead, he pulled his phone out again, casually tapping the screen. Hartley rolled his eyes. Look, no amount of money is going to change our policy. This isn't a place for just anyone. Shaq's smirk returned. Cool, he said, hitting send on his message. Just wanted to know what kind of place this is. Hartley frowned. What does that mean? Shaq slipped his phone back into his pocket and adjusted his jacket like he had all the time in the world. You'll find out soon enough, he said smoothly, turning toward the exit. But before he could take another step, a voice rang out. Wait, Mr. O'Neal. Hartley's face twisted in confusion as another man rushed toward them, his expensive loafers clicking against the marble floor. Shaq stopped, tilting his head slightly. "And who are you?" he asked, his deep voice carrying across the room. The man was older, well-dressed, and visibly out of breath. He shook Shaq's hand enthusiastically, offering a nervous smile. "I'm Robert Hastings, investor. You just texted about moving forward with a deal?" Hartley stiffened. The club guests fell completely silent. Shaq grinned. "Yeah, that was me." Hartley took a step forward, his voice uncertain for the first time. "What? What deal?" Shaq exhaled, throwing one last glance around the room. "Oh, nothing big," he said, grinning wider. "Just buying part of the marina." The entire club gasped as the weight of Shaq's words sank in. The moment Shaq turned to leave, a soft murmur rippled through the entrance. A young black couple had just arrived, dressed elegantly. He in a tailored navy suit, she in a stunning emerald green dress that shimmered under the club's dim lights. They held hands confidently, approaching the hostess stand with the same air as any other guest. But before they could even finish their first step inside, the hostess abruptly raised a hand. "I'm sorry," she said, voice crisp and firm. "Members only." The man furrowed his brow, pulling out an invitation from his pocket. "We were invited," he said. "Our friend, Mr. Hastings, sent us the details himself." The hostess barely glanced at the paper before shaking her head. "Sorry, sir. We're at full capacity." Shaq stopped mid-step. His jaw tightened. From where he stood, he could clearly see multiple empty tables, waiters lazily circling the room with trays of untouched champagne. "Full capacity?" the woman repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Shaq wasn't the only one watching now. A few nearby guests glanced over, some shifting uncomfortably, others smirking. Hartley, the manager, sauntered over, adjusting his cufflinks with an exaggerated sigh. "I don't make the rules, folks, but I do enforce them, and unfortunately, tonight, we have no room for extra guests." The couple exchanged a knowing look. It wasn't the first time they'd been turned away for an unspoken reason. The woman opened her mouth, to protest, to demand a reason, but her date squeezed her hand gently, shaking his head. "Let's just go." Shaq clenched his fists. He'd been watching the entire scene unfold, seen the moment of excitement turn into disappointment, seen the flash of recognition in the couple's eyes. They were about to step back toward the exit when a deep, authoritative voice cut through the air. "Nah!" Everyone turned. Shaq took one step forward, then another. He pointed at the couple, then at an open table near the water. "They're staying." The entire club fell silent. Hartley's smirk vanished. The hostess blinked. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. The couple froze, looking at Shaq in shock. Hartley laughed dryly, shaking his head. "I don't think you understand, Mr. O'Neal. We have a strict policy." Shaq tilted his head. "And I own part of this marina now." Hartley's breath caught in his throat. The guests gasped as realization dawned, and the young couple slowly turned back toward the entrance, waiting for the next move. Hartley crossed his arms, shaking his head in disbelief. "And who exactly are you to make that call?" The tension in the club was palpable. Guests clutched their drinks, their whispered conversations hushed. The young black couple stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. Shaq let out a deep chuckle, his towering frame unshaken. He adjusted his watch, taking his time before answering. "Man, you should really check your emails." Hartley scoffed. "I don't need to check anything. I run this club. I know exactly what's going on." Just as he finished his sentence, a sharp chime echoed through the air. Ding. Hartley's phone had just received an email. The manager frowned. He hesitated, then slowly pulled the phone from his pocket. As he read the message, his entire demeanor changed. His face turned pale. His shoulders stiffened. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Shaq smirked. "Go on, read it out loud." Hartley gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. That's not possible." Shaq casually took a sip from a glass of water left on a nearby table. "Oh, it's very possible." The guests started leaning in, whispering to one another. A few of them pulled out their own phones, checking for updates. A silver-haired investor near the bar furrowed his brow. "Hartley, what's going on?" Hartley's lips pressed into a thin line as he tried to keep his voice steady. It says, the marina ownership has changed hands. Shaq grinned. Mm-hmm. Keep reading. Hartley's breath shuddered as he forced himself to finish. And as of today, a new investor has acquired 30% of the property. The entire club erupted into murmurs. 30%? Wait, who? Hartley's voice cracked as he finally reached the name. Shaquille O'Neal. Silence. Then, wait, what? The collective gasp from the elite members rippled through the club like a shockwave. Wine glasses clinked as people turned to face Shaq, their faces frozen between disbelief and panic. One woman in pearls clutched her husband's arm. He's bluffing, right? A man in a navy blazer adjusted his tie. I didn't see that sale coming. The silver-haired investor from earlier stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Is this true, Shaq? Shaq took a step forward, resting both massive hands on the counter. He nodded. Yep, just signed the deal this morning. Hartley visibly trembled as his own club guests turned their attention on him. Shaq clapped his hands together. And since I'm a part owner now, I think we need to have a little chat about these outdated guest policies. The elite guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing the club's power structure had just dramatically shifted, and they had no idea what Shaq would do next. Hartley's breath hitched. His fingers clawed at his phone screen, as if reloading the email would somehow change its contents. That must be a mistake, he stammered. Shaq chuckled, leaning casually against the bar. He pulled out his own phone, tapping the screen a few times. No mistake. He turned the phone around, showing the official confirmation email from the property board. A heavy silence spread across the room. Shaq tilted his head. And guess what? Hartley's jaw clenched. I'm thinking of changing the guest policy. The murmurs started immediately. Wait, what? He can't just do that. A man in a navy suit adjusted his gold cufflinks nervously. He's bluffing, right? A woman in an expensive red dress gripped her champagne flute tightly. They wouldn't actually let him make changes, would they? Shaq slowly folded his arms, watching the room descend into unease. He didn't need to say much. He let the panic bloom naturally. Hartley forced a laugh, though his voice cracked slightly. This club has rules, and even if you own a stake, you can't just walk in and start making changes. Shaq smirked. See, that's where you're wrong. He tapped his phone again and slid it across the bar counter. Hartley hesitated before picking it up. His eyes darted over the message. It was from the Board of Investors. All new policy changes must be discussed by shareholders. Effective immediately, Shaquille O'Neal has full voting rights. Hartley visibly paled. The club members whispered louder now. The elegant, untouchable atmosphere of the yacht club was crumbling by the second. Meanwhile, the waitstaff had stopped taking orders. A bartender set down the glass he was polishing and leaned in toward a fellow server. Did you hear that? He owns part of this place. A young hostess lowered her notepad, looking around as the weight of the moment hit her. We don't have to listen to Hartley anymore? For the first time, the employees looked hopeful. Hartley saw the shift in their expressions and panicked even more. All right, let's not get ahead of ourselves, he shouted, forcing another fake smile. This is just a misunderstanding. We'll get it sorted out. Everyone just relax. But no one was listening to him anymore. Shaq drummed his fingers against the bar, enjoying the unraveling. Relax, he repeated. Man, I feel pretty relaxed already. Hartley's hands balled into fists at his sides. He opened his mouth to argue, but the front doors swung open. A group of powerful-looking investors strode in, eyes locked on Hartley. Hartley visibly gulped. The Board of Investors had just arrived, and from the look on their faces, Hartley was in deep trouble. The heavy wooden doors of the yacht club swung open, and the air shifted instantly. A group of wealthy investors strode in, their polished shoes clacking against the marble floor. Their tailored suits screamed power, but their expressions burned with fury. Hartley, the manager, froze on the spot, his fake confidence crumbling. One of the investors, a sharp-eyed man in his 60s, scanned the room before his gaze landed directly on Shaq. We just heard Shaquille O'Neal owns 30% of our marina, the investor said, voice calm yet lethal. His name was Gerald Whitman, a real estate mogul who had far more influence than Hartley ever would. Hartley let out a dry laugh, adjusting his tie. Yes, but before he could finish, another investor, a tall woman in a navy blue power suit, cut him off. Then why the hell are you kicking him out? She snapped, her voice echoing across the silent lounge. Hartley's face drained of color. The whispers in the club grew louder. Wait, so he really owns part of this place? Hartley just tried to throw out a major investor? Shaq, still leaning casually against the bar, smirked. He hadn't said a word yet. Just watching Hartley squirm was entertaining enough. Hartley fumbled for an explanation. Well, you see, there was a misunderstanding. Mr. O'Neal didn't. Gerald stepped forward, his silver cufflinks gleaming under the chandelier light. Didn't what? He interrupted smoothly. Didn't fit your little elitist club's image? Didn't match your standard? Because that's sure as hell what it looks like. Hartley started sweating visibly. He looked around desperately, but none of the other club members came to his defense. Shaq finally decided to speak. Nah, let's be real here, he said, straightening up. He tried to flex his little power trip on me, and now he's looking real stupid. A few guests chuckled under their breath, enjoying the show. Investor number 2, the woman in navy, crossed her arms. We've spent years maintaining our reputation as an exclusive marina, but what's worse for business, allowing someone like Shaq in or having a manager stupid enough to push out one of our most valuable investors? Hartley's lips parted, but no words came out. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, frantically checking his emails, as if he could somehow fix this. But the decision was no longer his to make. Shaq smirked, looking straight at him. You got 2 options, boss man. Own up to what you did, or keep digging that hole you're in. Hartley's breath hitched. The entire club was watching him like prey trapped in a spotlight. One of the bartenders stopped polishing a glass and whispered to a coworker, "This is getting good." As the tension suffocated the room, Gerald Whitman stepped even closer to Hartley and delivered the final blow. Maybe it's time we discuss new management. Hartley's stomach dropped. Every pair of eyes turned toward Shaq, waiting to see his next move. Shaq tapped his fingers against the bar, his massive frame leaning effortlessly against it. He watched as the club's elite squirmed, their carefully curated confidence starting to crack. So, still think I don't belong here? He asked, his voice smooth but laced with a challenge. The investors whispered furiously among themselves, their nervous glances darting between Shaq, Hartley, and the crowd of club members who were now paying close attention. Gerald Whitman, the most senior investor, took a slow sip of his scotch before turning to his colleagues. We can't afford to lose him, he muttered under his breath. The woman in the navy suit nodded. Bad optics. Bad for business. This was a mistake. Hartley, the club manager, clutched his hands together, his once smug demeanor long gone. Beads of sweat lined his forehead as he desperately tried to salvage the situation. Look, maybe we overreacted, he said, forcing a weak chuckle. Shaq tilted his head, his expression unreadable. You think? The energy in the club shifted entirely. Just minutes ago, these same people scoffed at him, treating him like an outsider. Now they realized their mistake and were scrambling to clean up the mess. A waiter who had remained silent throughout the ordeal smirked slightly while wiping down the counter. The staff had seen this kind of elitist nonsense play out before, but never had they seen someone call it out so effortlessly. Gerald let out a long sigh, setting his glass down with a soft clink. He turned toward Shaq, his voice calm but authoritative. I think we need a policy change. The club members held their breath. Gerald looked around at the other investors. Effective immediately. The entire room stilled for a moment. Hartley blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You can't be serious. Gerald shot him a look that could kill. I'm very serious. Shaq let the moment sink in, then smirked, nodding slowly. That's what I like to hear. But just as things seemed settled, a furious voice cut through the air. You people are ruining this place. Everyone turned in unison to see an older man in a white blazer slam his drink down on the table, his face red with anger. This club was built on exclusivity. You let one in, and soon it won't be worth a damn. The room erupted in gasps. Even some of the more privileged members looked uncomfortable at how bluntly he'd exposed their underlying prejudice. Shaq just stared at him, his face unreadable. Then after a beat of silence, he let out a deep chuckle. Man, you just said the quiet part out loud. The investors turned on the man instantly, and before Hartley could react, Gerald pointed at the staff. Escort this fool out. Hartley's face drained of color as the weight of Gerald Whitman's words sank in. The once arrogant club manager, who had smugly blocked Shaq from entering, now stood frozen, eyes darting around in disbelief. You're done here. The room was dead silent for a split second, until the words fully registered. Hartley stumbled forward, his voice an uneasy mix of shock and desperation. Wait, what? Mr. Whitman, let's not be hasty. I've given years to this place. Gerald, ever composed, simply raised a hand, cutting him off. Years of exclusivity and arrogance, Hartley. And today, you embarrassed our brand in front of a man who now owns a piece of this marina. You made us look like fools. Investor one, a sharp-looking man in a dark blue suit, crossed his arms and let out a dry chuckle. Honestly, Whitman, we should have gotten rid of him sooner. How many members have left because of his nonsense? The murmur of agreement from the gathered elites made Hartley sweat harder. His head snapped toward his remaining allies at the bar, but not a single person defended him. This can't be happening, Hartley muttered under his breath, hands shaking as he tugged at his collar. Investor 2 sighed, shaking his head. You embarrassed the club, Hartley. Pack your stuff. From behind the bar, a sharp sound broke through the tension. A single slow clap, then another, and another. The waitstaff. They were clapping. A few at first, but then more joined in, smiling, whispering, even laughing at the downfall of the man who had made their lives miserable for years. Hartley's face twisted in humiliation. You're all laughing, he snapped, spinning toward them. I kept this place running. I made this club what it is. A bartender shrugged. Yeah? And now you're making it better by leaving. Laughter rippled through the room. Shaq, who had been watching the spectacle with amusement, finally stepped forward, towering over Hartley. Guess the club is maintaining its standards after all. His voice was calm, but the smirk on his face was anything but. Hartley fumed, his fists clenched as he glared up at the basketball legend. You think this is funny, don't you? Shaq tilted his head. Oh, I think it's hilarious. Hartley took a shaky breath, his pride shattered. He had spent years looking down on others, treating people like they were beneath him. Now he was the one being dismissed like an afterthought. With a final glare at the investors, the staff, and the smirking Shaq, Hartley yanked off his name tag, threw it on the desk, and stormed toward the exit. The doors swung open violently as he shoved past the stunned guests, his humiliation now complete. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Man, he walked out faster than he tried to kick me out. The moment Hartley stormed out, the tension that had gripped the club vanished. It was as if a weight had been lifted, and the energy in the room shifted entirely. The once whispering crowd broke into cheers, some raising their glasses toward Shaq. Never thought I'd see the day, a man at the bar chuckled. A waiter who had been standing stiffly all night finally smiled, nudging a coworker. Damn, that was satisfying. Shaq, still standing at the center of it all, glanced toward the entrance. The young black couple, who had nearly been turned away just minutes earlier, now sat at a prime table, flipping through the menu with relieved smiles. One of the club's investors, still shaken from the spectacle of Hartley's downfall, cleared his throat and turned to Shaq. Well, Mr. O'Neal, it seems we owe you an apology. Shaq raised an eyebrow, taking a sip from a glass of water. Apology's cool, but action's better. With that, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sign. A staff member stepped forward to take it, then carefully pinned it onto the club's announcement board. Open to all who respect others. A wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd. Some of the wealthier members shifted uncomfortably, while others, especially the younger, more progressive ones, nodded in approval. One of the bartenders grinned. Finally, a rule that actually makes sense. At their table, the young couple Shaq had stood up for shared a toast, their smiles full of gratitude. This place has the best view, the woman murmured, looking out at the ocean sparkling under the club's terrace lights. Her partner chuckled. Yeah, but the best part is knowing we actually belong here. Shaq sat down at a nearby table, finally relaxing as a server brought him a meal. He picked up his glass and clinked it against the table lightly. Two real change. The room erupted in cheers, and for the first time all night, the club felt alive. Waiters who had spent years walking on eggshells around snobby guests now moved more freely, serving customers without hesitation or fear. Shaq glanced around, taking it all in. This was how it should have been all along. As the energy in the club buzzed with excitement, one of the younger staff members leaned toward a coworker and whispered, "Yo, you think he's about to buy even more of this place?" His coworker smirked. "Man, if I were Shaq, I'd buy the whole damn thing." Shaq leaned back in his chair, smirking as he overheard the whispers. Now there's an idea. The celebration was in full swing, but just as Shaq settled into his seat, a familiar voice cut through the noise. "This isn't over." Every head turned toward the entrance. Hartley, the ex-manager, stormed back into the club, his face red with frustration. His once pristine suit was now wrinkled, and beads of sweat dripped down his forehead. Shaq, mid-bite into his steak, didn't even flinch. He wiped his mouth, leaned back, and sighed. "Man, I was hoping you'd just go home." Hartley pointed a shaking finger at the investors. "You can't just throw me out like this. I built this place." The club fell into silence as the board members exchanged glances. One of them, a tall man in a navy suit, adjusted his cufflinks and shook his head. "And you almost destroyed it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hartley glanced around, searching for even a single ally among the guests he used to cater to. Nothing. Even the waitstaff he once bullied avoided his gaze. The rich elites who had laughed alongside him just an hour ago pretended not to see him. He swallowed hard. His arrogance had shattered, leaving behind nothing but desperation. "Okay, fine," he muttered, his voice losing its edge. "I made a mistake, but maybe we can fix this?" Shaq raised an eyebrow. "We?" Hartley forced an uneasy smile. "Yeah, I mean, look, I got carried away. I admit it. But I know this club better than anyone. You want to make changes? I can help." Shaq tilted his head. "That's funny, because just a few minutes ago, you were throwing people out for not belonging here." Hartley's jaw clenched. He looked around once more, but the reality had already hit him. He had no power left. His shoulders slumped. "Please, just give me another chance." Shaq tapped his fingers on the table, pretending to think. He could feel the entire room hanging on his response. Then a smirk crept onto his face. He leaned forward, locking eyes with Hartley. "All right," he said slowly. "You really want a second chance?" Hartley nodded eagerly, hope flickering in his eyes. Shaq's smirk deepened. "Cool. I got just the job for you." The waitstaff exchanged curious glances as Shaq gestured toward the back of the club. "Hope you're not afraid of a little hard work, Hartley." The room fell silent as Shaq leaned forward, his smirk widening. "All right, Hartley. You really want a second chance?" Hartley nodded eagerly, relief washing over his face. He truly believed Shaq was about to reinstate him, let him reclaim his title, and restore his place at the top of the club. But Shaq had something else in mind. "Great," Shaq said, standing up to his full height. "You can start over, as the new janitor." The words hit like a gut punch. Hartley froze, his hopeful expression twisting into shock. What?" The board members exchanged knowing smirks, and one of the investors chuckled. "Yeah, we do need a new cleaning crew, and after the mess you made here seems like the perfect fit." Laughter rippled through the club, but Shaq remained serious. "You wanted a second chance," Shaq continued, locking eyes with Hartley. "Well, this is it. You get to stay, but not as the big boss. You're going to learn what it means to actually work for respect." Hartley looked around desperately, hoping for someone, anyone, to defend him. But the same elites who once laughed at his arrogance now sipped their drinks in silence. He had burned every bridge. His shoulders slumped. His pride screamed at him to walk out. But where would he go? His career was finished, his name was ruined, and the only option left was the one Shaq had just given him. After what felt like an eternity, he let out a shaky breath and nodded. All right, he muttered, barely audible. I'll do it. Shaq clapped him on the shoulder, his voice firm but not unkind. Good. Now maybe you'll understand respect. A month later, the club had completely transformed. The energy was different. The tension and snobbery replaced with warmth and inclusivity. A new sign now hung proudly at the entrance, open to all who respect others. Inside, Shaq relaxed at his usual table, enjoying a meal. The staff smiled freely. The new manager, a former employee Hartley had overlooked, ran things with dignity, and the club was thriving more than ever. Across the room, a familiar figure quietly mopped the floor. Hartley, now dressed in a janitor's uniform, kept his head down, wiping away scuff marks on the marble. His once pristine suit and smug attitude were gone, replaced with humility and silence. Shaq watched him for a moment, then stood up, leaving a thick envelope on the table. A waiter picked it up and gasped. Sir, this is a $10,000 tip. Shaq smirked, glancing at Hartley one last time. Respect isn't about power, he said, turning to leave. It's about character.